Sarah Martinez stepped out of the small corner grocery store, balancing 2 heavy bags of groceries while trying to keep her phone pressed against her ear. Her 3-year-old son Miguel tugged at her worn jacket, asking for the candy he'd seen near the checkout counter. The autumn wind cut through her thin coat as she struggled to maintain her grip on everything. "I understand the payment is late, but I get paid on Friday." She spoke into the phone, her voice tired but patient. The landlord on the other end wasn't interested in excuses. Sarah had heard it all before: threats of eviction, late fees, the same conversation that happened every month when money ran short. As she ended the call, Miguel started crying. He was hungry, tired, and confused about why they couldn't buy the small toy car he'd pointed to in the store. Sarah knelt down on the sidewalk, setting her groceries aside to comfort her son, her knees pressed against the cold concrete as she wiped his tears with her sleeve. "Mama knows you want the car, mijo," she whispered, pulling him close. "Maybe next time when we have a little more money, okay?" Her own eyes filled with tears as she made promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The weight of single motherhood pressed down on her shoulders like the heavy grocery bags she'd been carrying. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and Sarah gathered their things, taking Miguel's small hand in hers. They walked slowly, her son's short legs struggling to keep up. Every step reminded Sarah of how different their life had become since Miguel's father left 2 years ago. She worked double shifts at the diner, but it never seemed like enough. Other people hurried past them on the busy sidewalk, everyone focused on their own destinations. Sarah didn't notice the expensive cars parked along the street or the well-dressed people entering the upscale restaurants nearby. Her world had shrunk to the immediate concerns of bus fare, grocery money, and keeping her son safe and fed. When they finally reached the bus stop, Sarah checked her watch. The next bus wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. She sat on the metal bench, pulling Miguel onto her lap to keep him warm. The shopping bag sat at her feet, filled with generic brands and marked-down items she'd carefully selected to stretch their food budget through the week. A black sedan pulled up to the curb across the street. Sarah barely glanced at it, her attention focused on keeping Miguel entertained while they waited. She didn't see the woman who stepped out of the car, dressed in a simple but elegant coat. She didn't notice how the woman paused, observing the mother and child on the bench with gentle eyes. The woman across the street was Elena Richardson, though Sarah had no way of knowing this. Elena had built a technology empire from nothing, turning a small software company into a billion-dollar corporation. But right now she wasn't thinking about board meetings or stock prices. She was thinking about the young mother she'd just observed, remembering her own struggles from years past. Elena had been running late for a charity board meeting when she'd noticed Sarah and Miguel. Something about the scene had stopped her in her tracks. Perhaps it was the way Sarah had knelt on the sidewalk to comfort her son, or the careful way she'd counted coins before entering the store. Elena recognized the signs of someone working hard but barely getting by. As Elena watched, she made a decision that would change both their lives. She instructed her driver to wait and began walking across the street toward the bus stop. She had no elaborate plan, just an instinct to help. Her wealth had taught her that the most meaningful gestures often came from simple human connection, not grand announcements or public displays. Sarah was singing softly to Miguel in Spanish when she noticed someone approaching. The woman looked kind, with graying hair and gentle eyes that seemed genuinely interested in them rather than judgmental. Elena sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving respectful space but offering a warm smile. "Your son is beautiful," Elena said simply. Sarah smiled back, a genuine expression that lit up her tired face. "Thank you. He's my everything." There was pride in her voice despite their circumstances. Miguel looked up at the stranger with curious eyes, then buried his face shyly against his mother's shoulder. The 2 women began to talk, sharing the easy conversation that sometimes happens between strangers, waiting for the same bus. Elena asked gentle questions about Miguel, and Sarah found herself opening up more than she usually did. There was something trustworthy about this woman, something that made Sarah feel less alone in the world. Neither woman could have predicted that their chance meeting would soon be interrupted by chaos, or that Elena's quiet act of kindness would be misunderstood in the most dramatic way possible. The seeds of conflict were already being sown just a few blocks away, where another woman was having the worst day of her life and looking for someone to blame. Victoria Blackwood slammed her car door so hard the sound echoed through the parking garage. Her designer heels clicked angrily against the concrete as she marched toward the elevator, her perfectly styled blonde hair slightly disheveled from running her hands through it in frustration. The crystal pendant around her neck caught the artificial lighting as she jabbed the elevator button repeatedly. The morning had started badly and gotten progressively worse. Her husband's credit card had been declined at the exclusive boutique where she'd planned to buy a dress for tonight's charity gala. The embarrassment still burned in her cheeks as she remembered the sales associate's apologetic smile and the whispers from other customers who recognized her. There must be some mistake, she'd insisted, pulling out her phone to call Richard immediately. But her husband's assistant had delivered news that made Victoria's blood run cold. The SEC was investigating Richard's investment firm for securities fraud. All their accounts had been frozen pending the investigation. Victoria's world was crumbling and she refused to accept it. She'd grown up with money, married money, and built her entire identity around the lifestyle that wealth provided. The thought of losing everything terrified her more than she could admit. Instead of fear, she chose anger. Someone had to be responsible for ruining her life. As she drove through the city, Victoria's rage built with every red light and every reminder of the life she might lose. The expensive shops, the exclusive restaurants, the social circles that had defined her existence, all of it could disappear. She needed to blame someone, anyone, for the chaos threatening to destroy everything she held dear. When she spotted Sarah and Elena at the bus stop, something inside Victoria snapped. She saw Elena's expensive coat and assumed the worst. In her twisted thinking, Elena represented everything wrong with her situation. Wealthy people who flaunted their success while Victoria's own world fell apart. She didn't see Elena's genuine kindness or Sarah's struggle. She only saw a target for her fury. Victoria parked her car haphazardly and stormed toward the bus stop. Her heels struck the pavement with sharp, angry sounds that announced her approach. Sarah looked up, instinctively pulling Miguel closer as she sensed the hostility radiating from the approaching woman. Elena remained calm, though she could clearly see that trouble was heading their way. "You people make me sick," Victoria shouted as she got closer, her voice carrying across the busy street. "Sitting there acting like you own the world while decent people lose everything." Her words made no sense to Sarah, who couldn't understand why this stranger was directing such hatred toward them. Elena stood up slowly, positioning herself slightly in front of Sarah and Miguel. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Elena said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. But Victoria was beyond reason. The morning's humiliations had pushed her past the point where logic or kindness could reach her. She saw Elena's composed demeanor as arrogance, another sign of the entitled, wealthy elite she blamed for her problems. "Don't you dare talk down to me!" Victoria screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at Elena. "I know exactly what you are. You think your money makes you better than everyone else. You sit there in your fancy clothes, probably laughing at people like her." She gestured wildly toward Sarah, who was now standing with Miguel in her arms, ready to leave if necessary. Elena remained perfectly still, her hands open and non-threatening. Years of boardroom negotiations and hostile takeover attempts had taught her how to stay calm under pressure. "Ma'am, I think you're upset about something that has nothing to do with us," she said gently. "Perhaps we could talk about what's really bothering you." This reasonable response only fueled Victoria's rage further. She interpreted Elena's calm tone as condescension, another example of wealthy people treating others like children. In her mind, Elena was everything wrong with the world, privileged, untouchable, and completely unaware of how ordinary people suffered because of the games rich people played. "You want to know what's bothering me?" Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "People like you ruin lives and then sit around pretending to be saints. You take everything from families like mine and then act innocent when someone calls you out on it." Tears of frustration and rage rolled down her cheeks, smearing her expensive makeup. Sarah watched the confrontation with growing alarm. She didn't understand why this woman was so angry, but she could see the situation was escalating dangerously. Miguel had started crying, frightened by the shouting. Elena caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly toward the street, silently suggesting they should leave. But Victoria saw the exchange and interpreted it as more evidence of their supposed conspiracy against her. "Oh, you think you're just going to walk away?" she shrieked, stepping directly into Elena's path. "You think you can ruin people's lives and then disappear like nothing happened?" The confrontation had attracted attention from other pedestrians, who stopped to watch from a safe distance. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. Victoria noticed the growing audience and felt vindicated. Finally, people would see these privileged women for what they really were. Elena made one last attempt at de-escalation. "I honestly don't know what you think I've done to you, but I promise you that whatever's happening in your life, taking it out on strangers won't help anyone." Her voice carried genuine concern, both for Victoria's obvious distress and for the safety of Sarah and Miguel. Those words of reason were the final trigger Victoria needed. In her mind, Elena's compassionate response was the ultimate insult, proof that this wealthy woman thought she could solve everything with a few kind words. The rage that had been building all morning finally found its target, and Victoria's hand rose before she could stop herself. The slap echoed across the busy sidewalk like a gunshot. Elena's head turned sharply to the side from the force of Victoria's hand, her cheek immediately reddening where the blow had landed. For a moment, the entire scene froze, Victoria breathing heavily with her hands still raised, Elena touching her face in shock, and Sarah clutching Miguel protectively while staring in disbelief. The crowd of onlookers gasped collectively. Several people had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be just another street argument. Instead, they had captured something much more dramatic. The sound of the slap seemed to hang in the air as everyone processed what had just happened. Elena slowly turned back to face Victoria, her hand still pressed against her stinging cheek. Despite the assault, her expression remained calm, though her eyes showed the shock of being attacked by a complete stranger. She had faced hostile board meetings, aggressive competitors, and countless challenges in building her business empire, but she had never been physically assaulted on a public street. Victoria immediately realized she had gone too far. The rage that had driven her to strike out began to fade, replaced by a creeping awareness of what she had just done. She looked at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else, unable to believe she had actually hit another person. The crowd was staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. I didn't mean..." Victoria started to stammer, but the words died in her throat. There was no taking back what she had done. The video phones surrounding them had captured everything, and she could already imagine the footage spreading across social media. Her husband's legal troubles were bad enough. Now she had created a scandal of her own. Sarah stepped forward instinctively, her maternal instincts overriding her own fear. "Are you okay?" she asked Elena, her voice full of genuine concern. She shifted Miguel to her hip and reached out tentatively, wanting to help but unsure if she should interfere further. The kindness in her gesture stood in stark contrast to Victoria's violence. Elena nodded slowly, lowering her hand from her cheek. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though the red mark on her face told a different story. She looked at Victoria with something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't anger either. Years of experience had taught her that people who lashed out like this were usually fighting battles that had nothing to do with their immediate targets. "Why did you do that?" Elena asked Victoria directly, her voice still calm despite what had just happened. "What did you think that would accomplish?" The question wasn't accusatory but genuinely curious, as if Elena truly wanted to understand what had driven a stranger to assault her on a public street. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. The weight of her crumbling marriage, her frozen assets, the SEC investigation, and now her own violent outburst crashed down on her all at once. She sank onto the bus stop bench, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. The sound was raw and desperate, coming from someplace deep inside where all her fears lived. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, some showing sympathy for Victoria's obvious distress, while others remained focused on the fact that she had just committed assault in broad daylight. A few people approached Elena to check on her condition, but she waved them away politely, her attention now focused on the woman who had attacked her. Elena sat down beside Victoria on the bench, maintaining some distance but close enough to speak quietly. Sarah watched in amazement as the woman who had just been slapped showed concern for her attacker. "Whatever is happening in your life," Elena said gently, "this isn't the way to handle it. You've made things worse for yourself now." Through her tears, Victoria looked up at Elena with confusion and shame. "Why are you being nice to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I just hit you in front of all these people. You should call the police. You should press charges." Her words carried a mixture of gratitude and guilt that made her cry even harder. Elena considered this carefully. She could indeed call the police, and Victoria would likely face charges for assault. The video evidence was clear, and there were plenty of witnesses. But looking at this broken woman beside her, Elena saw someone who was already drowning in problems far bigger than a moment of misplaced anger. "What's your name?" Elena asked instead of answering directly. Victoria hesitated, then whispered, "Victoria Blackwood." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but Elena's expression shifted slightly. She recognized it from news reports about the SEC investigation into Blackwood Investment Group. Suddenly, Victoria's attack made more sense. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue, offering it to Victoria without a word. The simple gesture of kindness made Victoria cry harder, overwhelmed by the contrast between her own behavior and Elena's grace under pressure. She took the tissue gratefully, dabbing at her eyes and trying to compose herself. "Mrs. Blackwood," Elena said quietly, "I've been following the news about your husband's company. I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you." Her words weren't judgmental or pitying, just a simple acknowledgement of Victoria's situation. It was perhaps the first genuinely compassionate response Victoria had received since the investigation became public. Sarah listened to this exchange with growing understanding. She didn't know the details of what Elena was referring to, but she could see that Victoria was someone whose world was falling apart. Having experienced her own share of financial struggles and public embarrassment, Sarah felt unexpected sympathy for the woman who had seemed so hostile just minutes earlier. The crowd was beginning to disperse, realizing that the drama had shifted from conflict to something more like reconciliation. But the phones were still recording, and Elena was keenly aware that whatever happened next would likely end up online. She needed to decide quickly whether to treat this as a criminal matter or an opportunity to demonstrate a different kind of response to violence and pain. Elena pulled out her phone, and for a moment Victoria flinched, expecting her to call the police. Instead, Elena scrolled through her contacts and found the number she was looking for. "James Richardson's office," came the professional voice of her husband's assistant. "This is Elena Richardson. Is James available? I need him to make a call." Victoria's eyes widened as she heard the name. Richardson Global Enterprises was one of the largest technology corporations in the world, and James Richardson was known as one of the most powerful CEOs in the industry. The realization hit Victoria like a second slap. She had just assaulted the wife of a billionaire, and it had all been recorded. Within minutes, James Richardson himself was on the line. Elena stepped a few feet away for privacy, but Victoria could hear fragments of the conversation. Elena was explaining the situation calmly, asking her husband to contact his legal team not to prosecute Victoria, but to help her navigate the SEC investigation that was destroying her family. Sarah watched this unfold with amazement. The woman she had been chatting with at the bus stop, who had seemed so normal and kind, was apparently one of the wealthiest people in the city. Yet Elena had never mentioned her status, never acted superior, never treated Sarah any differently than she would treat anyone else. "I can't let you do this," Victoria said when Elena returned to the bench, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't understand what kind of person I am. What I just did to you, I've never hit anyone in my life. I don't know what came over me." Her hands were shaking as she tried to process the kindness being shown to someone who had just committed assault. Elena sat back down, wincing slightly as the movement reminded her of her bruised cheek. "I think I understand exactly what kind of person you are," she said quietly. "You're someone who's scared, overwhelmed, and facing the loss of everything you thought was secure. You're someone who made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic, but that doesn't define who you are." The wisdom in Elena's words came from her own experience. She hadn't always been wealthy. Her technology company had started in a garage, built through years of 18-hour days and constant rejection from investors. She remembered the desperate feeling of watching dreams slip away, the temptation to blame others when things went wrong. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and James Richardson himself stepped out. He was a tall man with graying temples, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. But like his wife, there was nothing arrogant in his manner as he approached the unusual scene at the bus stop. "Elena, are you hurt?" was his first question, his concern for his wife evident in his voice. He examined the red mark on her cheek, with the gentle touch of someone who had been married for 30 years. Only after assuring himself that she was okay did he turn his attention to Victoria, who was staring at him with obvious recognition and growing dread. "Mrs. Blackwood," James said, extending his hand in greeting rather than accusation. "I believe you're going through a difficult time with the SEC investigation. My legal team tells me there may have been some irregularities in how the investigation was conducted. We'd like to help you sort that out." Victoria couldn't process what was happening. She had attacked this man's wife in public, been recorded doing it, and now he was offering to help her with her legal problems. "Why?" was all she could manage to ask, tears streaming down her face again. "Why would you help someone who hurt your wife?" James glanced at Elena, and Sarah could see the communication that passed between them without words. "Because," Elena answered, "pain makes people do things they never thought they would do. And because someone helped us once when we needed it most." She looked at Sarah meaningfully. "Today reminded me that kindness is the most powerful force we have." Elena's assistant arrived with a first aid kit, having been called while James was on his way. As Elena's cheek was being tended to, she continued talking to Victoria. "The legal help comes with one condition," she said. "You need to get counseling to deal with whatever drove you to this point. And you need to apologize publicly, not just to me but to anyone who was influenced by your actions today." Victoria nodded eagerly, grasping at this unexpected lifeline. "I'll do anything," she said. "I can't believe—" "I mean, after what I did to you." She looked at the growing bruise on Elena's face with obvious remorse. The reality of her actions was becoming clear as her rage-fueled adrenaline faded. Sarah had been quiet throughout this exchange, holding Miguel and trying to understand the extraordinary scene playing out before her. When Elena turned to her, Sarah expected to be dismissed now that the real drama was over. Instead, Elena smiled and said, "Sarah, I'd like you to meet my husband, James. James, this is Sarah Martinez, the woman I was telling you about." James extended his hand to Sarah with the same respect he had shown Victoria. "Elena tells me you're a single mother working very hard to take care of your son. She was quite impressed with how you handled yourself today." Sarah shook his hand, confused about what Elena might have said about her during their brief conversation. "I work at Richardson Global," James continued, "and we're always looking for people who show the kind of character Elena saw in you today. Would you be interested in discussing some opportunities with our Human Resources Department?" He handed Sarah a business card with the company logo, his direct office number written on the back. Sarah stared at the card, unable to believe what she was hearing. I don't have a college degree," she stammered. "I've only ever worked in restaurants and shops." The idea that someone like James Richardson would offer her a job seemed impossible, like something that happened in movies but not in real life. Elena touched Sarah's arm gently. "Some of the most valuable people in any organization are those who understand what it means to work hard and take care of others," she said. "College degrees are helpful, but character is irreplaceable." Her words carried the weight of someone who had built a business empire and learned what truly mattered in choosing the right people. The crowd had mostly dispersed by now, but Sarah noticed that several people were still recording with their phones. She wondered what story would emerge from the videos they had taken, and whether anyone would believe the truth of what had actually happened at this bus stop. By evening, the first video had already gone viral. The caption read, "Entitled rich woman gets instant karma after attacking innocent mom." But the person who posted it had only shared the moment of the slap, leaving out everything that came after. Social media exploded with outrage, with thousands of people condemning Victoria without knowing the full story. Victoria sat in her empty mansion, scrolling through the hate comments on her phone, while her husband was in emergency meetings with lawyers. "Disgusting behavior," read one comment. "Rich people think they can do whatever they want," said another. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being attacked for being wealthy at the exact moment when her wealth was disappearing. But then other videos started appearing. Someone had filmed Elena's compassionate response, James Richardson's arrival, and the incredible scene of the billionaire couple offering help to both women. These videos told a completely different story, one that left viewers confused and amazed. The comments began to shift as people tried to understand what they were seeing. "Wait, so the woman who got slapped is Elena Richardson?" One comment read, She's worth like $50 billion and she just sat there and helped the person who hit her? Another user added, did anyone else notice how the mom with the kid got offered a job? This is the weirdest karma video ever. Sarah had no idea about the online drama. She was at home in her small apartment, staring at James Richardson's business card and trying to convince herself it was real. Miguel was playing with his toys on the living room floor, occasionally looking up at his mother with concern. He could sense that something important had happened, even if he didn't understand what. The phone rang and Sarah almost didn't answer it. Very few people had her number, and calls this late usually meant bad news. But the voice on the other end was professional and kind. Ms. Martinez, this is Jennifer Chen from Richardson Global Human Resources. Mr. Richardson asked me to call you about scheduling an interview. Sarah's hands started shaking. An interview? You mean today really happened? I thought maybe. She couldn't finish the sentence. Part of her had convinced herself that the encounter at the bus stop had been too good to be true. Some kind of misunderstanding that would be cleared up and forgotten. Oh, it definitely happened. Jennifer laughed kindly. And it's created quite a stir online, though I'm sure you'll see that soon enough. Mr. and Mrs. Richardson were very specific about wanting to meet with you as soon as possible. Would tomorrow morning work for you? After hanging up, Sarah sat in her kitchen and cried. Not the desperate tears of financial stress that had become so familiar, but tears of hope and disbelief. She called her mother, who had been watching Miguel during Sarah's work shifts, and tried to explain what had happened. Her mother listened in amazement, occasionally interrupting with questions that Sarah couldn't quite answer. Meanwhile, Elena was in her home office, dealing with a different kind of phone call. Her publicist was in panic mode, trying to figure how to handle the viral videos. Elena, some of these posts have millions of views already. People are calling you everything from a saint to a fool. We need to get ahead of this story. What story? Elena asked calmly, pressing an ice pack against her still swollen cheek. A woman having a bad day made a mistake and we tried to help her. That's not a story, that's just Tuesday. Her publicist sighed, clearly frustrated with Elena's refusal to see this as a public relations crisis that needed managing. Victoria was experiencing the worst night of her life. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from reporters, her neighbors had started avoiding her, and her husband was talking about leaving the country until the legal situation was resolved. But then her phone rang with a number she recognized, Elena Richardson's personal assistant. Mrs. Richardson would like to invite you to her home tomorrow evening, the assistant said professionally. She thought you might want to discuss how to handle the media attention before it gets worse, and she wanted to check on how you're doing. Victoria couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed once again by Elena's continued kindness. The next morning, Sarah stood outside the Richardson Global building, wearing her one good dress and carrying a folder with copies of her work history. The building was more impressive than anything she had ever entered, with marble floors and artwork that probably cost more than she made in a year. But the security guard smiled kindly when she gave her name, and she was escorted to an executive floor with views of the entire city. Jennifer Chen turned out to be a warm woman about Sarah's age who immediately put her at ease. Before we talk about job opportunities, she said, I have to tell you that what you did yesterday was remarkable. Standing by Mrs. Richardson when that woman was attacking her, showing concern for someone who had just been assaulted. That takes real character. Sarah was confused. I didn't do anything special, she said honestly. Anyone would have done the same thing. But Jennifer smiled and shook her head. Actually, most people would have walked away or started recording with their phones. You stepped forward to help. That's exactly the kind of person we want working here. The interview lasted 2 hours, covering everything from Sarah's work experience to her goals for the future. Jennifer explained that Richardson Global had several entry-level positions that came with full benefits, childcare assistance, and educational opportunities. We believe in growing our own talent, she said. If you're willing to learn, we're willing to teach. When Sarah left the building 3 hours later, she had a job offer, a starting date, and a salary that was triple what she had been making at the diner. She also had something else, a sense that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. As she walked to the bus stop where everything had started, she thought about the strange series of events that had brought her to this moment. Elena was right, Sarah thought as she waited for her bus. Kindness really was the most powerful force in the world. She had shown kindness to a stranger. Elena had shown kindness to everyone, and now that kindness was rippling outward in ways none of them could have predicted. Even Victoria, despite her terrible mistake, was being offered a chance at redemption. The bus arrived and Sarah climbed aboard for what might be one of the last times. Tomorrow she would start a new job, a new life, and a new chapter in the story that had begun with a simple conversation at a bus stop. She smiled as she thought about telling Miguel that their struggles were finally coming to an end, and that sometimes good things really did happen to people who tried their best to do right by others. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez walked through the same downtown streets where her life had changed forever. But now she wore a professional blazer instead of a worn jacket, and instead of struggling with heavy grocery bags, she carried a briefcase containing reports for the community outreach program she had helped design at Richardson Global. The job had been everything Jennifer Chen had promised and more. Sarah had started in customer service, but her natural ability to connect with people and her insights into the struggles of working families had quickly caught the attention of senior management. Within 3 months, she had been promoted to the Community Relations Department, where she helped design programs to assist single parents and low-income families. Miguel was thriving too. The company's childcare center had become his second home, and Sarah no longer worried about affording his basic needs. More importantly, she could see a future for him that extended far beyond just surviving each day. She had started taking night classes in business administration, paid for by the company's education program, and Miguel often did his homework alongside her at their new apartment's kitchen table. Elena Richardson had become an unexpected friend and mentor. They met monthly for coffee, where Elena shared hard-won wisdom about balancing work and family, building professional confidence, and navigating corporate politics. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago," Elena had told Sarah during one of their meetings. "Determined, resourceful, and completely unaware of your own potential." The friendship had surprised both women. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they shared similar values about hard work, family loyalty, and the importance of helping others. Elena found in Sarah a refreshing honesty about the realities of working-class life, while Sarah discovered that wealth didn't automatically corrupt people's character. Victoria Blackwood's story had taken a more complicated path. The SEC investigation had indeed been flawed, and with the help of James Richardson's legal team, most charges against her husband's company were dropped. But Victoria had insisted on making a public apology for her behavior, and she had followed through on her commitment to counseling. The therapy sessions had revealed that Victoria's attack stemmed from years of suppressing anxiety and building her identity entirely around external validation. Losing her wealth had triggered a complete breakdown of her sense of self, leading to the desperate anger she had directed at innocent strangers. With professional help, she began building a more authentic relationship with herself and the world around her. Elena had offered Victoria a position at one of Richardson Global's charitable foundations, working with families going through financial crises. It was paid significantly less than Victoria was accustomed to, but she discovered a sense of purpose she had never experienced during her years as a society wife. She was particularly good at counseling women whose families were facing bankruptcy or legal troubles. "I understand what it feels like when your whole world falls apart," Victoria would tell the women she counseled, "and I understand how easy it is to blame other people for your pain. But the only way forward is to take responsibility for your own actions and start building something real." Her clients responded to her honesty about her own failures and her genuine commitment to helping others avoid her mistakes. The viral videos from that day had eventually faded from social media attention, replaced by newer scandals and sensations, but the impact of what happened had continued growing in quieter, more meaningful ways. Sarah's story had inspired Richardson Global to expand their programs for supporting employees from disadvantaged backgrounds. Victoria's transformation had led to new approaches in the company's crisis counseling services. Elena often reflected on how a simple decision to approach a struggling mother at a bus stop had changed so many lives. She had been planning to attend a routine charity board meeting that day, the kind of obligation that filled her calendar but rarely felt personally meaningful. Instead, she had found herself part of a story that reminded her why she had wanted to build a successful company in the first place to create opportunities for people like Sarah. James Richardson had been equally affected by the experience. Watching his wife handle Victoria's attack with such grace had reminded him of why he had fallen in love with Elena 30 years earlier. He had also been impressed by Sarah's character and had personally overseen her rapid advancement within the company, making sure she had mentors and opportunities that would help her reach her full potential. The bus stop where everything began had become something of a local landmark. Though most people walking by had no idea of its significance, Sarah sometimes stopped there during her lunch breaks, remembering the day when her life had seemed hopeless and how quickly everything had changed. She would think about the series of small choices that had led to that moment. Her decision to comfort Miguel on the sidewalk, Elena's choice to sit down and start a conversation, Victoria's tragic decision to lash out in anger. On this particular afternoon, Sarah noticed a young woman sitting on the same bench where she and Elena had first met. The woman looked exhausted, holding a sleeping baby while counting crumpled bills from her purse. Sarah recognized the expression of someone trying to make impossible math work, wondering if there was enough money for both bus fare and dinner. Without hesitation, Sarah walked over and sat down on the bench. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I hope this doesn't sound strange, but I used to sit right here in almost the exact same situation. If you need help with anything, bus fare, information about resources in the city, or just someone to talk to, I'd be happy to help." The young woman looked up with suspicious eyes that gradually softened as she took in Sarah's kind expression and professional appearance. "I just moved here from Oklahoma," she admitted quietly. "I thought I had a job lined up, but it fell through. I'm trying to figure out how to get to the homeless shelter before it gets dark." Sarah smiled, thinking about how Elena had approached her with the same gentle respect 6 months earlier. "What's your name?" she asked. "And what kind of work are you looking for?" As the young woman began to share her story, Sarah pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her contacts at Richardson Global. An hour later, the young woman had Sarah's business card, an interview scheduled for the following morning, and enough money for a decent hotel room for a few nights. More importantly, she had hope. Sarah watched her walk away with renewed confidence and felt the satisfaction that came from passing forward the kindness that had saved her own life. Elena Richardson happened to drive past the bus stop just as this interaction was ending. She smiled as she watched Sarah helping another struggling mother, recognizing the continuation of a story that had started with her own impulse to help a stranger. She thought about calling Sarah to share what she had witnessed, then decided against it. Some acts of kindness were meant to happen quietly, without recognition or fanfare. That evening, all three women, Sarah, Elena, and Victoria, were in different parts of the city, but each was engaged in some form of service to others. Sarah was helping Miguel with his homework, while taking calls from other single mothers who had heard about Richardson Global's family support programs. Elena was reviewing applications for the company's new scholarship fund for non-traditional students. Victoria was leading a support group for women whose families were facing financial crisis. None of them thought of themselves as particularly heroic. They were simply people who had learned that responding to pain with kindness rather than more pain created possibilities that couldn't be imagined in advance. The viral videos from that day had focused on the drama of conflict and reconciliation, but the real story was quieter and longer lasting. The way one moment of choosing compassion over judgment had rippled outward to touch hundreds of lives. 6 months after a desperate woman had slapped a billionaire's wife at a bus stop, the most remarkable thing wasn't what had made headlines. It was the fact that 3 women from completely different backgrounds had discovered they shared the same fundamental belief: that everyone deserves a second chance, that kindness is always the right choice, and that the most powerful transformations happen not through grand gestures, but through the simple decision to see the humanity in every person we encounter. The bus stop remained just a bus stop, unmarked by any plaque or memorial. But for Sarah, Elena, and Victoria, it had become a symbol of the moment when their lives proved that the most ordinary places can become the setting for the most extraordinary changes. If only we have the courage to reach out to strangers with open hearts and generous spirits.